Next week we'll return to Plato's Symposium, and we'll be looking at the speech of Socrates. Socrates' speech is structurally more complicated than the other speeches because a large part of Socrates' speech is a report by Socrates of how he learned about the nature of love. And Socrates claims that he learned whatever it is he knows from a woman, Diotima. Within the context of the symposium, of course, this is a fairly shocking thing to say, since the atmosphere has been so macho, so male-oriented. So, something I'd like you to do as you think about Socrates' speech and about his report of how he learned from Diotima is whether that speech overcomes some of the limitations that macho context of the symposium has been laboring under ever since its very beginning, when both the god Dionysus and the goddess Aphrodite were excluded from the discussion. Then on Wednesday, a week from today, I will turn to some themes in both the book and the movie of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings that seem to me to pick up some of the themes that we're looking at throughout this section of the course. I wanted to remind you of where we stand right now. So, we've looked at the speech of Aristophanes that uses myth to talk about the nature of human love. A myth gets at human nature, at the essence of human beings, by giving us a history of human beings. In this respect, the most important myth in our culture still remains the Adam and Eve story from the book of Genesis. So I want to turn to that with an eye to how it compares to Aristophanes' myth of human origins and the nature of human love. But I want to start with Matthew 19. Matthew 19 is a chapter of the gospel that has a special focus on Jesus as a teacher. And it starts particularly from a teaching about marriage. Some Pharisees came and tested Jesus by asking him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any and every ground?" Jesus asked in return, "Have you never heard that the Creator made them from the beginning male and female?" And he added, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be made one with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It follows that they are no longer two individuals. They are one flesh. What God has joined together, man must not separate." Part of what's so striking about this passage is that Jesus combines two passages from Genesis. One is the passage from the creation myth about the 6 days, the line about, "Have you never read that the Creator made them from the beginning male and female?" He combines that with something from the Adam and Eve story, with an interpretation or comment upon Adam's reaction when he first sees the woman who's been created for him. So in Jesus' teaching here, two things that in the text are not immediately integrated are integrated. Jesus is teaching that somehow to understand what marriage really is, we have to combine things that we might have thought of separately. So let's turn our attention to Genesis and see what it is that this particular teacher is putting together when he teaches people about what marriage would be. The first passage, this is so famous it hardly seems worth quoting it, but I will anyway. It's from Genesis 1. This is around line 26, verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image and likeness, to rule the fish in the sea, the birds of heaven, the cattle, all wild animals on earth, and all reptiles that crawl upon the earth." So, what's being created in our image, that is, in God's image here, is the human being as such. This verse does not yet hint that in order to be an image of God, human beings will have to be sexually differentiated. You might say that if we read no farther, we would expect the foundation myth in Genesis to be more like the myth in Aristophanes, where the original perfect human nature is unitary, is asexual, is not sexually distinguished. The all-male, the all-female, and the androgynous beings in Aristophanes' myth of human origins are all unified images of human nature. Sexuality occurs only after the fall, in response to some infringement on divine privilege of original human nature. But Genesis goes on to say, "So God created man in his own image," still the unitary language. "In the image of God he created him," still the unitary language. "Male and female he created them." Suddenly we have sexual distinction. So the language emphasizes the way that humanity, all humanity, images God. But when we get down to the most articulated description of how humanity images God, it's through somehow maleness and femaleness together. One is not more an image than the other. Indeed, the image is incomplete without both. In this respect, too, we're reminded of an aspect of Aristophanes' myth. Aristophanes' notion that in our current state, we are simply broken halves. We are not wholes. That it's our sexuality, our erotic potential, that can return us to a state of wholeness. Here, what we have is that somehow the way that our humanness images God requires sexual diversity, sexual distinction. Now, what God goes on to say is, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, the birds of heaven, and every living thing that moves upon the earth." What does it mean in this text for humanity to image the divine? It means a number of things. One of the things it means is to be able to rule, to manage, to be stewards of the earth. But at its most basic, to image God here is to image what God is doing throughout this hymn to creation that begins our Bible. That is, to be creative, to be procreative. To image God is to be fruitful. So that it's in human fertility that humanity most deeply or most directly images this Creator God. So we see why the emphasis on humanity imaging the divine has as its punchline, its capstone, the notion that it's human sexuality that allows us to image at least this aspect of the divine most potently, most fully. Again, we're reminded of certain aspects of Aristophanes' myth. Particularly, we're reminded of the way that the gods see to it that human sexuality serves a divine purpose. But that divine purpose of human procreativity, human fertility, is not itself an image of anything divine in Aristophanes' speech. The imaging of the divine in Aristophanes' speech comes about in the original asexual human nature. Sexuality, you might say, in Aristophanes' speech, is a purely human concern. It serves divine purposes, but it is not itself part of what makes us an image of something divine. We image the divine in Aristophanes' speech through our sphericity, our self-sufficiency. So, one verse that Jesus draws on for his own teaching about marriage, marriage under the threat of divorce, is this emphasis on humanity's sexuality as essentially connected to fertility, to creativity or procreativity. The second verse that he draws on comes from the second chapter of Genesis. The specific myth about the creation of human beings in the Garden of Eden. Now, in this myth, first there's a man, Adam. All of the animals are created and are brought to him as potential partners. When God says it's not good for the man to be alone, I'll provide a partner for him. But man gives a name to all the animals. That is, all of the animals are subordinated to man's cognitive power, to his command over language. None of them are a fit partner because all of them in some way are subordinate to human purpose. In light of this human specialness, where can humanity find something that makes of it a partnership? Now, think here again back to Aristophanes' myth. In this account of humanity, humanity has not yet fallen. Humanity has done nothing wrong. It's intrinsic to our completed state that we need partnership. Our incompleteness is not a punishment for anything. Adam is not broken or wounded. He simply needs partnership. So, here in this history of humanity, our need for partnership is a part of our perfection. It's a part of what human perfection is. It is not a falling off from some state of human perfectibility. Then, and we all know the story, the Lord God puts Adam into a deep sleep, and he constructs a woman from a part of Adam's body. Not an animal constructed in such a way that it's subordinate to the man, but rather a partner that's so equal with Adam that she's created from his own body. Now, the man has not had the experience of partnership before. And when this woman is brought before him naked, he loses it. And he babbles. Now, he babbles in a way that's meaningful, but it's also just about ungrammatical. What he says in this particular translation, and the English always cleans it up a little bit, what he says is, "Now this at last, bone from my bones, flesh from my flesh." He says, "Oh my God, she's naked. What? Whoa, what is that? This is a partner. This is not something subordinate to me. This is me, but it's outside of me. My partnership, my union with this being is as intimate as my partnership with myself. Except she's beautiful." So, at this moment, we have a radical distinction between any kind of subordination relationship Adam might bear to the animals and the true partnership that would fulfill him. Now, to be sure, Adam, like lots of men, will be tempted in various ways to treat his wife as a subordinate. The Bible has lots to say on these sorts of issues. But subordination within the marital partnership will be understood as something that occurs after the fall. It is a part of human imperfection, not a part of human perfectibility. And it's after this babbling joy of Adam in seeing what a real partner would be for him that we have the passage, the commentary, from which Jesus quotes. "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and the two become one flesh." So, think back to Aristophanes again. In Aristophanes' myth, the human sexual drive, erotic satisfaction, is driven by reunion. It's that sense of reunion, of a perfect partnership that makes us fully integrated and whole again, that's behind the sexual drive. So too in this story about Adam, about the man and the woman. After all, Adam does not say, here is the woman who can be the mother of my children. What he says is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. He focuses on the intimacy of the union, the intimacy of the partnership possible with this other being. So, we've got two stories about maleness and femaleness. In the one, the emphasis is on fertility as an imaging of God's creativity. In the other, we have a story about the intimacy of partnership, of union. What Jesus does in Matthew 19 is to put these two right next to each other as a teaching about the possibilities of marriage, about what a marriage could be. Aristophanes' myth also considers both of these aspects of human sexuality, the unitive and the procreative. But in Aristophanes' way of telling the story of human nature, these two drives are kept separate. Now, when we return to Matthew 19, we learn something more about this. The picture of the union possible for a man and a woman that we get from Genesis when we put together the passages the way that Jesus does in this particular chapter, the picture that we have looks very demanding. And that's the way that both the Pharisees and Jesus' own disciples experience this teaching. So after Jesus says, look, the intimacy of this partnership and the imaging of God in this partnership is so complete that there's no such thing as divorce. You've become one whole organism. There's no more divorce. That would be like cutting yourself in two in order to be double. If you decided that there should be more people like you around, and you take an axe and cut yourself through the middle of your head down through your groin, you've made a terrible conceptual error. You're not a worm. You can't double yourself that way. And what Jesus is suggesting is that it's that bad of a mistake conceptually to think you can divorce your spouse. You're one thing. In this respect, again, there's something in this story that's a lot like Aristophanes' story. It turns out the way we are now, uncoupled, is something that has to be seen as incomplete, that's completed by our coupling. And so to break an erotic couple is itself to return to a state of brokenness, not primarily to a state of freedom, a state of self-sufficiency. Now, then as now, a lot of people heard that and thought, well, God, what if she turns out to be a bitch? What if he's a drunk? You mean I'm stuck with him? God, I mean, I'd hack off my arm if it was a drunk. I'd at least cut off my little finger if it whined at me every morning. You mean there's no escape hatch? Why then did Moses lay it down that a man might divorce his wife by note of dismissal? Now, of course, the social context here hadn't altogether changed, but the social context here is that it's the woman who's much more likely to be abandoned by her husband, who decides that maybe he'd like to go back to the original state of brokenness after all. And Jesus has a really interesting answer. Jesus says, well, here's why Moses gave you the escape hatch. It was because your minds were closed that Moses gave you permission to divorce your wives. But it was not like that when all began. Clearly, he's thinking back to the passages from Genesis he just quoted. I tell you, now, you get away with this if you're both God and man. If you're just a man, it's a little harder to get away with just saying, okay, yeah, Moses said X, but I say not X. So he says, I tell you, if a man divorces his wife for any cause other than unchastity and marries another, he commits adultery. Now, the translation I just read has Jesus say, it was because your minds were closed that Moses gave you permission to divorce your wives. That's a reasonable translation, but there's a really beautiful Greek word in this passage. The first syllable of it is sclero, where we get medical words like sclerosis of the liver or arteriosclerosis. It's a word that means hard or hardening. Sclero, and the second syllable of it is cardia, where we get, of course, words like cardiac. It's the word for heart. What Jesus says is that the Mosaic law compromised with your hardness of heart, your sclerocardia. Now, in an ancient Semitic context, the heart is not primarily an organ of feeling or affection the way it is for us. It's primarily an organ of perception. So that what Jesus is saying, in a way, is that your problem is when you want an escape hatch in your marriages, you're hard of hearing. You're not listening to something. And in particular, what you're not listening to is what you really wanted out of marriage in the first place. You can see in the eyes the sparkle of a couple on their wedding day, that when they say those vows, for better, for worse, till death, you can see that they really want to mean what they're saying. But there's a kind of self-reservation, a kind of fear that makes us not quite hear the very words that we're saying as we're saying them. As if there's an undertone of maybe later, but not quite yet, in those words that pledge us to something till death, for better, for worse. So it's our sclerocardia, our hardness of heart. My translator has it, our closed minds. Maybe that's a little too cognitive. It's not just that there's some thought that you're not letting in. There's also some feeling or some experience that you're not letting in. And what Jesus says here is that the time has come to let that thought back in. The time has come to listen to it again. Now, the reaction of the disciples is really interesting. Now, the disciples, I mean, some of them were as young as you are. John was probably younger than you are right now. Some of them were quite a bit older. But they were all men. And they're standing around and they just heard what he said, and they're kind of looking at each other out of the side of their eyes. Did you hear what the hell's he saying? And so one of the disciples, or it sounds like quite a few of them because it's plural, the disciples said to Jesus, well, if that's the position with husband and wife, it's better not to marry. I mean, I've seen some wives. I don't think I would take that risk, Jesus. This sounds like a mad course of action. It's imprudent. Nobody could pledge themselves to be married no matter what. There's got to be an escape hatch. I mean, you wouldn't build a building without a fire escape. It's like against the building codes of marriage somehow. And Jesus looked them in the eye and said, yeah, you know, you might be right. You might not be the kind of guy who should get married. You might not be man enough to get married. He says not everyone can accept it. But why did you think everybody was big enough to get married? A lot of you might be teeny tiny little men right now. You're going to have to grow quite a bit before you could get married. And then Jesus goes on to say, he says, it's something which not everyone can accept, but only those for whom God has appointed it. And then he goes on to say, there are some who are incapable of marriage because they were born so, or who were made so by men. He's thinking of eunuchs. But he says there are others who have themselves renounced marriage. And some of the disciples are thinking, you know, that sounds better. If there's no divorce, I think I'm going to renounce marriage. But then Jesus gives them this punchline. He says, yeah, they've renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So look, if you look into your heart and you say, I can't marry someone without having the escape hatch of divorce, Jesus doesn't tell his disciples when they say that to him. He doesn't say, well, okay, just don't get married. What he says is, look, it can make sense for you to decide that marriage isn't the way of life for you. But don't do it because you're going to leave your hard heart. Do it because you're going to open your heart even more than marriage does. That you're going to give up marriage for the sake of devoting yourself to the kingdom of heaven. Not for a less demanding ideal, but for one that might be even more demanding. That requires you to give up your closed heart. The openness of marriage becomes then a sign and a symbol of the possibility of an openness that hadn't even entered their minds. The possibility of a complete openness that doesn't have within it the satisfactions of a private family, but that devotes one entirely to service of the kingdom of heaven. So when Jesus is emphasizing here that there's something in what human beings want from each other when they desire marriage that is frightening, that seems to take on too much risk to be prudent. What Jesus is also trying to emphasize is that a lot of life is like this. It's not just marriage that asks you to take this on. It's everything about following his teaching, particularly in the radical way that a life of vowed celibacy might require. But from the point of view that Jesus has just preached here, it turns out that a married man or a married woman is more like a priest than like an unmarried man or an unmarried woman. It turns out that when you get engaged, you've entered the seminary. There's a continuity between the life of celibacy and the life of expressed sexuality in marriage, because both of those commitments require an overcoming of sclerocardia. It's no wonder the disciples found this all a little surprising, and the disciples are very slow learners in the gospel. It's not like they all ran over and gave Jesus a hug and said, I'm so glad I'm clear on all that now. Here's the next thing that happens. Matthew it's a very funny gospel if you're in the right mood. It's So the next thing that happens is people brought children to Jesus. This is right after. People brought children for Jesus to lay his hands on them with prayer. The disciples rebuked them. Get those kids out of here. Jesus is thinking. But Jesus said to the disciples, "Let the children come to me. Do not try to stop them. For the kingdom of heaven," remember he had just told them, look, think through what marriage is and you'll see that maybe a life of complete devotion to me would be to give up even marriage for the kingdom of heaven. So the kingdom of heaven's coming back here with a new emblem, the emblem of childlikeness. Jesus says, "Let the children come to me. Do not try to stop them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." And he laid his hands on the children and went his way. So the first thing after the disciples wish there were an escape hatch in a marriage, the very next thing that happens is they don't understand children. And instead, Jesus gives them an example of openness to children. And that openness is emblematic of what acceptance of the kingdom of heaven would be. So, the myth of marriage that's embodied in Matthew 19, especially when we look back at the way it was in the beginning, at the first 2 chapters of Genesis. The myth of marriage there has many points of contact with Aristophanes' myth. But the myth of marriage in Matthew is much more demanding in its way. But on the other hand, it's much more optimistic. Because the myth in Genesis does not make human sexuality a function of our imperfection. It makes it instead an expression of our perfection. In Aristophanes, sexuality is not a punishment, but it's the result of a punishment. In Genesis, sexuality has nothing to do with punishment. The punishment after the fall, which is the next chapter of Genesis, corrupts sexuality, diminishes it. But sexuality as such is a part of the Garden of Eden. It's a part of what it would be to be as perfect as a human being can be. One of the most striking philosophical issues, then, that's raised by the competition between Aristophanes' myth and the Genesis myth is the question of whether the human erotic drive, whether what we're trying to listen to and articulate, like those lovers in their bed that the god Vulcan comes down and visits, what we're trying to articulate is something that combines a desire for union with a desire for creation. Aristophanes introduced the theme of reproduction, of procreativity, into the symposium. But in Aristophanes' myth, union and creation are kept separate. And the human erotic drive focuses only on the one, on union. In the Genesis myth, at least as interpreted by Jesus in Matthew 19, there's an integration of those two into one form of human desire, a form that we can listen to only if we can overcome a certain hardness or a certain fearfulness. What we'll turn to next week in Socrates' speech is that moment in the symposium that also tries to integrate the procreative and the unitive into one unified form of human erotic desire.